Alrighty, students, here we go. Your Chapter 20 review video for your assessment tomorrow. Remember, our essential question for Chapter 20 is how did African Americans face slavery and discrimination in the mid-1800s, which means we'll be looking a little bit at the North, but specifically at the South to determine how African Americans faced slavery in the mid-1800s. So starting up with the North, slavery, of course, was outlawed in the North. So African Americans living in the North were living free. However, that did not mean that they had the same rights or the same freedoms as the whites did. I remember they still didn't have the right to vote. They were still not welcome in the same churches, not welcome in the same schools. When it came time to getting jobs, they were allowed to have jobs, but they were often given lesser jobs or they were paid less. So even though African Americans in the North were free, they still weren't treated as equal. And the big word that we will use to describe and talk about that is segregation, right? That is when you separate two groups. Could be based on race, could be based on gender, could be based on age, but it's just separating groups based on some characteristic. And because they were segregated, they also faced discrimination. Remember, discrimination is just unequal treatment. You could have discrimination without segregation, but segregation generally leads to discrimination. Then in the South, we do have some free African Americans living in the South. A small number, maybe 5% of the total African American population in the South was free. And there was still a lot of segregation in the South as well, a lot of racism, a lot of hostility towards those free African Americans, and they faced even further restrictions, like they weren't allowed to own weapons and things like that, for fear that they might try and lead some type of revolt or uprising. And then as we focus on the slave population in the South, remember, slaves in the South, they had no rights whatsoever. They were viewed as property to be bought and sold at their master's discretion. And they were, an investment, a piece of farm equipment. We compared them to, like a tractor or, cattle or something like that, but an investment that the plantation owner or that the slave owner would have made in the slave. So we understand the cruelty of slavery, but we've also taken a look at kind of the economic reasons for slavery. Remember, in the late 1790s, an inventor from the North named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And that was that machine that separates the stems and the seeds and gives you the nice poofy, fluffy cotton. And in class, we talked about how, wow, that should probably lead to a decrease in slavery because now one slave can do the work of about 50. However, the exact opposite happened, and we saw an explosion of slavery from 1800 to 1850 because the demand for cotton increased. Because now a slave owner or a plantation owner could grow way more cotton, invest way more in slaves, and make way more money. So this this cotton gin led to a boom, a cotton boom, an economic boom for the South. Remember, we talked about how if the South was its own country at the time, it would have been the fourth richest country in the world in 1860. And we talked also about how cotton in 1860 was the single largest export in the United States, and it was so large of an export that it was brought more money into the country than all other exports combined. And that also helps to answer the question of why would white Southerners who didn't own slaves, who couldn't afford slaves, who never would have owned slaves, why would they still support slavery? And the major reason is economics. If you take slavery out of the South, the Southern economy would have looked very different, and it would not have been as prosperous because all this cotton was raised, and tobacco and indigo and rice and those other products was grown and taken care of with slave labor, with free labor. So the big reason why white Southerners who did not own slaves still supported slavery was economics. And then even if you look at the lower class whites, the lowest, economically speaking class whites, they also would have wanted to hang on to slavery because that also meant that they were not the bottom, right? There was still kind of that bottom rung of society below them. So there's economic reasons as well as racial reasons. Moving on and talking about the working conditions of slaves, we know basically that a majority of them would have been considered field hands, working out in the field, sun up to sundown, picking, planting, harvesting cotton. Some of the other jobs they would have had, they could have been blacksmiths, they could have been servants in the house, they could have, worked in the barnyards and things like that, but a large majority of them would have been called field hands, and they would have been doing the field work. And then once those days were over, they still had their own chores to take care of, their own food to cook and things like that. So their day often went beyond sun up to sundown. And we also know the working conditions, they were harsh. They were working in the South. It was hot, it was manual labor, it was physical, and they also had to deal with the overseers, right? The people who would make sure that they were working hard, and sometimes they would resort to violence on them. Their living conditions, the housing that they lived in was cramped, dirt floors, not a lot of furniture, not really mattresses, hot in the summer, cold in the winter. So their housing was pretty awful. However, their food wasn't as bad as you would imagine. And of course, that was because, slaves, they were expected to work in the field for many hours a day. And if you're going to be working long hours, you obviously need to have good nutrition, something to power you through the day. So, we're not talking, Bobby Flay gourmet restaurant food or anything like that, but we're definitely talking, a decent meal throughout the day. And then medical care was the other one where we're kind of like, oh, wow, yeah, I guess that makes sense, but it's kind of strange. Slavery, it's this cruel, racist thing. But the medical care that slaves received was fairly decent by the standards of the day. And again, slave owners, they're investing a lot of money. In 1860, if you convert it to our dollars today, the average slave is ranged in price from $30,000 to $50,000. That's the price of a very nice car these days. So it's not something that you just buy and just throw away. So that's kind of a bit about the working and living conditions. As far as methods used to control slaves, remember there were people, they were called slave breakers. Their job was to break in slaves physically and mentally, to emotionally tear them down, to physically tear them down, to literally beat them into submission. In class we talked, well, why didn't they just fight back? And some of them did, but of course when you're raised your whole life in an environment like that, and with slave breakers and beatings and whippings, that's just kind of all you know. So they would do things like that. Runaways, after they were captured, sometimes their Achilles tendon would be slashed. That's that tendon right there, right? They would have their Achilles tendon slashed, or an ear cut off, or a whipping, or sometimes punished by death and hangings. And so we saw that. Remember, Frederick Douglass, the slave breaker that he dealt with, Frederick Douglass eventually had enough, and he went after the guy. He beat him and choked him. And afterward, Frederick Douglass said, the next man who tries to whip me is going to also have to kill me. So slaves did fight back. Another one that fought back, of course, and resisted was Nat Turner, leading Turner's Rebellion, where rounded up a group of slaves. They became armed, and over the course of a couple of days in Virginia, killed 30 to 40 whites, men, women, and children. And before they were rounded up in themselves, Nat Turner and the people who were part of his rebellion were also hung. So resistance did happen. But this open resistance, this violent resistance, wasn't as common as what we call quiet resistance or passive resistance, where slaves, they would play dumb and act like they didn't know how to do anything. They would break tools. They would damage crops. Remember, we read the story of the one slave who pretended that he was blind for a number of years until finally he was set free, and then poof, magically, hey, he was healed. But he, played it up that he was blind, so he was useless, so that he could just be set free. So that's the type of resistance that most slaves practiced, because it was easier to get away with, it was safer, and it would still be a way to kind of fight back. And it would, it'd be still something that they could do to get back at their masters and at their owners. And then as we start to look at the social life of slaves, family life, community life, things like that, the number one lesson that many parents taught their children in a slave community was a lesson of respect. Respect for their elders and respect for the other children. They lived in this kind of harsh environment, but they taught, you have to be respectful. You have to be respectful at all times in whatever you do. And so that was something that was very commonly taught, and it was a lesson that was really instilled into the slave children, who they would then pass it down on to their children. Just kind of that idea of respect. And they also, they formed families, and that's where we see the tradition of jumping the broom kind of comes out, where their weddings, obviously, they couldn't be married in a church and they wouldn't be officially recognized, so they developed their own ceremonies. And we talked about, jumping over the broom and things like that. Of course, the biggest fear that any slave would have had, it wouldn't have been the whippings, it wouldn't have been the beatings or anything like that, but it would have been having your family members sold away. As a parent, a mother or a father, having your children taken from you, literally snatched out of your arms and sold off to someone else, and having a family torn apart, or your husband or your wife or another loved one sold apart. That would have been the biggest fear that they would have had, and it happened all too often. A very frequent occurrence where families would have been ripped apart at the auction block. And then in their leisure time, a lot of song, spirituals, things like that. Sometimes these songs would be sung in the field. Sometimes just sung to pass the time. They would develop games, right? They would make games out of the chores they had to do, like husking corn. They would have corn husking bees, or they would see who could husk shuck the most corn the fastest, right? Something they had to do, so let's make a game out of it. They would tell folk tales. Quilting was another big one, where they would tell stories. A lot of times those biblical stories, we looked at those quilt patches, the story of Moses leading the slaves out of Egypt was one of those biblical stories that really resonated and was powerful for a lot of slaves. And a lot of these leisure activities that they would do, they would also try and, connect and bring back their cultural African roots. So they would talk about things geographically in Africa. They would talk about the animals, stories. They had a very strong oral tradition where they would pass down their culture and their language to their children. And they would try and pass this on through generations. Another big component were what we called the invisible churches, right? They would develop their own churches. It wasn't like, going to a Lutheran service or a Catholic mass or synagogue or anything like that, what we might be familiar with. It was, very spiritual, oftentimes combining elements of Christianity that they heard from their masters with some of their tribal religions from Africa. So they're just kind of very spiritual. And these invisible churches, they would be very emotional, very joyous, a lot of singing, a lot of preaching, a lot of happiness. And it was just kind of this outlet. Of course, they were called invisible because they had to be secretive. The slave owners would have not allowed that or tolerated that. So that's kind of the big things that you need to be aware of for Chapter 20. As far as Chapter 19 is concerned, there's going to be a couple of questions on that. Just remember the industrial North and the agricultural South, and we started talking about sectionalism. Sectionalism, of course, is loyalty to the region or interests of your section rather than the nation as a whole. But those are kind of the big components, the big things that we need to be aware of. I think that's everything. Let me just double check my list to make sure I got it all for you. Yeah, that should cover it. You guys will do great. Just kind of look over the, the review game notes that we took. That's all I got. Best of luck. See ya.